The 23rd of August 1939. Moscow. The banquet hall of the Kremlin was ablaze with lights. A celebratory dinner was underway that made the entire world drop its jaw. The Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov and the Nazi German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop had just signed a document that shocked the globe, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At the climax of the banquet, Stalin, the Pope of the communist world, raised his glass and delivered a famous toast to this group of high-ranking Nazi officials. "I know how much the German nation loves its Führer. I should therefore like to drink to his health." At that moment, history seemed to glitch. Two mortal enemies, ideologically irreconcilable and sworn to destroy each other, were now embracing like long-lost brothers. This toast sent chills down the spine of the entire world. Why? Was Stalin insane? Didn't he know that Hitler had written clearly in Mein Kampf that Germany's Lebensraum, living space, lay in the east, and that the Soviet Union must be destroyed? Of course, Stalin knew. But he believed he was playing a brilliant game of chess. This brings us to the first psychological puzzle we need to deconstruct today: the resonance of bandit logic. Stalin didn't trust the British. He didn't trust the French. In his eyes, those Western democracies were hypocritical, weak conspirators who always wanted to divert the flood eastward, hoping the Soviet Union and Germany would slaughter each other. In contrast, he found Hitler more relatable. This wasn't friendship. This was the mutual appreciation between mob bosses. Stalin had privately marveled at Hitler's methods to those around him. Specifically, in 1934, when Hitler launched the Night of the Long Knives to purge SA leader Rome, Stalin commented, "That fellow does it beautifully. That's how you deal with political opponents." In Stalin's view, Hitler was a pragmatic villain just like himself, and since he was a villain, deals could be made. Stalin's calculation was precise. This treaty would not only keep the Soviet Union out of the impending European war, but also allow the Soviets to grab a massive dividend without firing a shot. Just 1 week after the treaty was signed, Germany blitzed Poland, and World War II erupted. 17 days later, the Red Army entered Poland from the east. Two demons shook hands over the corpse of Poland and partitioned the country. Immediately after, Stalin annexed the 3 Baltic states and launched the Winter War against Finland. Stalin looked at the map, at the border expanding westward, and was extremely satisfied. He had established an eastern buffer hundreds of kilometers wide. He firmly believed he had traded a piece of paper for the most precious commodities: strategic space and time. This period is known to historians as the Devil's Honeymoon. During these 2 years, the Soviet Union not only supported Germany diplomatically, but became its economic bloodline. Under trade agreements, the Soviets continuously shipped oil, grain, manganese, and rubber to Germany. It was a scene dripping with irony. German tanks were powered by Soviet fuel. German soldiers ate bread baked from Soviet wheat as they swept through France and bombed London. Stalin was personally feeding the beast that was about to devour him. But why wasn't he afraid? Because he had fallen into a fatal confirmation bias. Stalin had a deep-seated obsession. Hitler was a rational gambler. His logic went like this: Germany lost World War I because it fought a 2-front war. Until Hitler thoroughly defeated Britain, he would never be crazy enough to attack the Soviet Union. That would be suicide. Because Stalin himself was an extremely cautious man, he defaulted to assuming Hitler was also cautious. He applied his own logic to a madman. This led to the most absurd scene in the history of intelligence. The whole world knew Hitler was going to attack the Soviet Union, only Stalin didn't. Spring arrived in 1941. Intelligence regarding Germany's imminent invasion flew toward the Kremlin like snowflakes. This intelligence wasn't hearsay. It was precise to the extreme. The Soviet ace spy, Richard Sorge, sent a top-secret telegram from Tokyo. He not only confirmed the intent to attack, but even gave the specific date, around June 22nd. Sorge even listed the number of divisions the Germans would commit: 170 divisions. British Prime Minister Churchill, though he hated communism, intercepted German troop movement orders via the Enigma machine. He personally sent a private letter to Stalin, warning him that German troops were massing on the border. And then there were reports from the front lines. German reconnaissance planes frequently crossed the border. German soldiers were dismantling barbed wire along the boundary. There were even German deserters who ran over to surrender, saying, "The war starts tonight." Faced with this mountain of evidence, what was Stalin's reaction? Anger. Not anger at the Germans, but anger at the intelligence officers. On Sorge's intelligence, he scribbled, "This is disinformation sent by a liar hanging around in small factories and brothels." On another military report, he wrote, "Send the man who filed this report to be shot. He is spreading panic." As for Churchill's warning, Stalin was even more dismissive. "This is a cheap, divisive tactic by the British. They can't hold on much longer, so they want to drag me into the water to fight their war. I won't fall for it." This is the tragedy of a dictator. When you have killed everyone who dares to speak the truth, when only yes men remain around you, you lose the ability to perceive reality. Everyone knew Stalin didn't want to hear the word war, so everyone filtered the intelligence, feeding him only news that the Germans don't have winter gear ready, or the German army is still resting. Stalin locked himself in a bubble made of fantasy. Inside this bubble, he was the master manipulator of the world. Hitler was his partner, and the war wouldn't start until at least after 1942. The 21st of June, 1941, Saturday. This was the last day of peace. The atmospheres in Berlin and Moscow were starkly different. In Berlin, Hitler had already signed the attack order codenamed Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft were lying in wait along the immense border, bullets in chambers, engines warmed up. In Moscow, Stalin was still at his dacha watching a movie, then going to his office to process paperwork. That night, the situation at the front was tense to the breaking point. German sabotage teams had already infiltrated and cut communication lines. Soviet border guards were frantically calling, requesting permission to enter combat readiness. People's Commissar for Defense Timoshenko and Chief of General Staff Zhukov, holding urgent telegrams from the front, barged into Stalin's office, begging for a mobilization order. Stalin remained indecisive. He paced back and forth in his office, blue smoke rising from his pipe. He roared at Zhukov, "This might just be a provocation by German generals. Hitler might not know about this. If we mobilize troops, we give them the excuse to start a war. Do not fire, do not provoke." Finally, under the desperate pleas of his generals, Stalin reluctantly agreed to issue a toothless Directive No. 1. This directive required troops to maintain high vigilance, but strictly ordered them not to take any measures that could be construed as hostile actions. By the time this directive was sent, it was already the early hours of June 22nd. It was too late. Communication lines had been blown up. Many units never received the order. The most ironic scene of the day occurred at midnight. A Soviet freight train, fully loaded with wheat and fuel, slowly crossed the border bridge at the Brest fortress and entered German territory. This was the last shipment of supplies from the Soviet Union to Germany under the trade agreement. A few hours later, this bridge would be crushed under the treads of German tanks. This fuel would be pumped into German bombers to blast Soviet cities into ruins. This grain would feed German soldiers, giving them the strength to slaughter Soviet civilians. Stalin had used every means to avoid war, only to use his own resources to personally arm the invader. 3:15 a.m. The night was torn apart by countless flashes of fire. Thousands of German cannons fired simultaneously, shattering the earth. The Luftwaffe crossed the border like a dark cloud, pouncing on Soviet airfields that were still asleep. In just a few hours, 1,200 aircraft of the Soviet Air Force were destroyed on the runway before they could even take off. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were encircled and slaughtered in the chaos. The phone in the Kremlin rang. When Zhukov reported the outbreak of war to Stalin, there was a deathly silence on the other end of the line. We cannot know exactly what Stalin was thinking at that moment. Was it fear, regret, or the shame of being played for a fool? We only know that this man of steel, who thought he had calculated everything, suffered a mental breakdown in that instant. He lost his gamble, and he lost it completely. The chips were no longer oil and wheat, but the lives of tens of millions of Soviet people. But the reason a devil is that he does not die easily. After a brief period of paralysis and seclusion, Stalin would wake from his fear. He would use a method even more cruel and cold-blooded than Hitler's to win this gamble. Since I cannot defeat you with wisdom, I will drown you in corpses. Late June 1941. The Kuntsevo dacha, outskirts of Moscow. This green villa, hidden deep within the forest, was currently silent as the grave. The telephone lines were unplugged, the curtains drawn tight. The air inside was thick with the suffocating stench of stale tobacco. Stalin had vanished. In the first few days following the German invasion, Stalin had tried to maintain his work routine in the Kremlin. But the news from the front arrived like a relentless nightmare. Minsk had fallen. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were encircled, and German armored columns were slicing through Soviet defenses like a knife through butter, charging toward Moscow at a speed of 80 kilometers a day. On June 28, upon learning of the fall of Minsk, Stalin snapped completely. He exploded in an irrational rage at People's Commissar for Defense Timoshenko and Zhukov, and then uttered a famous, dispirited line: "Lenin left us a great legacy, and we, his unworthy heirs, have shat it all away." After saying this, he abandoned everyone, fled back to the Kuntsevo dacha, locked himself in his room, and refused to answer any calls or sign any documents. It was an extremely dangerous power vacuum. The ship was burning, and the captain was hiding in his cabin. 2 days later, June 30, other members of the Soviet Politburo, Molotov, Beria, Voroshilov, and others decided to drive to the dacha to find him. When their convoy stopped at the villa's entrance, and when they pushed open those heavy oak doors to enter Stalin's room, a scene of immense dramatic tension unfolded. Stalin was sitting on the sofa, his face pale, his hair disheveled, looking as if he had aged 10 years in an instant. When he saw his subordinates walk in, his body instinctively shrank back, his eyes filled with fear. Historians later analyzed that, in that moment, Stalin thought they were there to arrest him. By Stalin's own logic, if someone made such a colossal error that brought the nation to the brink of extinction, that person had to be shot. He was ready to face his reckoning. But Molotov broke the silence. He did not pull out a pistol. Instead, he said in a pleading tone, "Comrade Stalin, we need you. The State Defense Committee needs a chairman, and that person can only be you." Hearing this, the fear in Stalin's eyes vanished, replaced by incredulous surprise, followed immediately by the ecstasy of something lost being found. He realized, these slaves have been tamed so thoroughly that without me, they don't even dare to rebel. They can't even think independently. They aren't here to kill me. They are here to beg me to remain their master. Stalin slowly stood up and straightened his collar. In that moment, the panicked old man disappeared, and the cold-blooded dictator returned. He said, "Very well, if you insist." July 3, Stalin finally broke his silence and delivered a radio address to the nation. This time, he did not use the cold, intra-party address, "Comrades." Instead, he used an unprecedented opening. "Brothers, sisters, I appeal to you, my friends." This was a massive signal. Stalin realized that communist slogans were no longer enough to make people go to their deaths. Faced with the threat of national extinction, he had to awaken the oldest form of Russian patriotism. He was no longer the aloof Red Tsar. He disguised himself as the guardian of Mother Russia. But beneath the mask of the benevolent father, the heart remained stone. To prove his resolve, and to show Hitler that the Soviet Union would never surrender, Stalin did something that defied humanity. Less than a month into the war, Stalin's eldest son, Yakov, an artillery lieutenant, was captured by the Germans during the Battle of Smolensk. The Nazis treated this as a jackpot. They printed millions of leaflets featuring photos of Yakov chatting with German officers and dropped them from planes over Soviet lines. The leaflets read, "Look, even Stalin's son has surrendered. Why are you still resisting?" This was a massive humiliation for Stalin. Later, through the Red Cross, the Germans proposed an exchange: Yakov for the German Field Marshal Paulus, who had been captured by the Soviets. This happened later, after Stalingrad, but reflects the same logic. Or, earlier on, they proposed exchanging him for other German generals. Stalin gave a reply so cold it chilled the world: "I will not trade a marshal for a soldier." Some accounts even suggest that Stalin believed Yakov's capture rather than suicide was itself a betrayal. Because of this, Stalin even arrested Yakov's wife, his own daughter-in-law, and sent her to the Gulag. This was the signal Stalin sent to the world: if even my own son can be sacrificed, then among you the 200 million people of the Soviet Union who cannot be sacrificed. Summer 1942. Although the Red Army had miraculously held Moscow in the winter of 1941, by 1942, the situation had deteriorated again. The Germans launched Case Blue, a summer offensive sweeping across southern Russia, aiming straight for the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga River. Soviet morale plummeted, and mass desertions occurred. Some units routed upon contact. Thousands of soldiers raised their hands in surrender. Stalin realized that patriotism and appeals were no longer enough. Fear had to be upgraded. The 28th of July, 1942, Stalin signed one of the most brutal orders in the history of human warfare, Order No. 227. The core spirit of this order was a single phrase: not one step back. Ni shagu nazad. This was not a slogan, it was a precise mechanism for killing. The order stipulated: 1. Abolition of the right to retreat. Any commander who retreated without orders from superiors would be considered a traitor and immediately court-martialed or shot on the spot. 2. Penal battalions, Strafbat. Officers and soldiers who committed offenses were stripped of their rank and placed in penal battalions. These units were sent to the most dangerous sectors of the front, into minefields and against machine gun fire. Their mission was to clear mines with their bodies and wash away their crimes with their blood. Their average survival time was only a few days. 3. Blocking detachments, Zagardotriad. This was the most terrifying part. Behind the lines of the regular army, blocking detachments formed by NKVD troops were deployed. They set up Maxim heavy machine guns, aimed not at the Germans, but at their own men. The order explicitly stated, in case of panic and chaotic retreat, they are authorized to shoot on the spot. Imagine that hellish scene: German tanks and flamethrowers in front, your own side's machine guns behind. A Soviet soldier had no choice. Charge forward, and you might die. Run backward, and you will definitely die. In this ultimate despair, fear was transformed into frenzied combat effectiveness. Since death is certain either way, I might as well take a few Germans with me. After Order No. 227 was issued, the rout of the Soviet army miraculously stopped. Historians debate this order fiercely. Some call it a crime against humanity. Others call it a necessary evil to save the nation. But regardless, it demonstrated Stalin's core logic as a wartime commander. Victory is higher than life. He turned the war into a simple math problem. The Germans do not have enough bullets to kill every Soviet person. As long as we die slower than the Germans can manufacture bullets, we will win. Relying on this cold-bloodedness of treating human lives as numbers, Stalin finally dragged Hitler into the one war he wanted to fight, least a war of attrition. And at the forefront of this war of attrition lay a city named after Stalin himself. There, the gamble between the two dictators would reach its climax. Hitler swore to take it, Stalin swore to hold it. It would no longer be a city, it would be the largest meat grinder in human history. Autumn 1942, on the banks of the Volga, Stalingrad. This place was no longer a city. It was a pile of burning rubble, a jungle of reinforced concrete, a massive grave. For Hitler, this city possessed a fatal magic, not only because it strangled the transport artery of the Volga, but because it was named Stalingrad. Hitler roared at his generals, "If we do not take this city, we will lose face in the East." Stalin ordered his generals, "This city bears my name. If it is lost, the spine of the Soviet Union will be broken." And so, this battle transcended the realm of pure military strategy and became a private duel between two dictators. But at the critical moment of this duel, we witness an astonishing reversal in the art of command. First, look at Stalin. After experiencing the disastrous defeats of 1941 and the blind command errors of early 1942, Stalin changed. The Stalin who once thought he understood military matters, who drew wild lines on maps with red and blue pencils, and who forced troops into suicidal attacks, suddenly disappeared. Replacing him was a supreme commander who had learned to listen. In September 1942, when Zhukov and Vasilevsky were whispering in a corner of the Kremlin, discussing a counterattack plan, codenamed Uranus, Stalin walked over. If this had been a year earlier, he would have interrupted them, scolded them for fearing the enemy like tigers, and ordered a frontal assault. But this time, Stalin simply listened quietly. He looked at the map and asked one question: "Are you sure we have enough reserves?" When Zhukov insisted on pausing all local counterattacks to accumulate strength for a massive encirclement, Stalin suppressed his impatient nature. He nodded and said, "Very well, do it according to your plan. If you are right, the honor is yours." This was a massive shift. Stalin finally understood a truth: professional matters must be left to professionals. He began to play the role of an arbitrator. He let the generals argue, then he made the final decision and took responsibility for providing logistical support. He no longer interfered in tactical details, focusing instead on the allocation of strategic resources. This delegation of power finally allowed the intellectual superiority of the Soviet General Staff to shine. Now, look at Hitler. In contrast to Stalin's evolution, Hitler was undergoing a catastrophic devolution. During the Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941, Hitler had ordered no retreat, and the German army had actually withstood the Soviet counterattack. This experience gave Hitler a false signal. My willpower is more effective than the general's professional knowledge. By the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler had gone completely mad. He fired Chief of General Staff Halder for a lack of Nazi fanaticism. He began micromanaging everything. Sitting in the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, thousands of miles away, he tried to direct the attack vector of a single battalion on the Stalingrad front. He stared at flags on a map, unable to see that frontline soldiers were already eating rats and horsehides. When General Paulus reported that the Sixth Army was exhausted and needed a tactical withdrawal, Hitler's answer was nothing but hysterical screaming. No retreat, not even a millimeter. This is a contest of will. Hitler turned a flexible war of maneuver into a static war of attrition, the very thing he was worst at. And this was exactly what Stalin wanted. In the ruins of Stalingrad, Soviet commander Chuikov invented a hugging tactic, hugging the enemy. Soviet soldiers hid like rats in sewers, basements, and even bomb craters. They deliberately pushed their defensive lines to within dozens of meters of the Germans. Why? Because at that range, the powerful German Air Force and artillery dared not open fire for fear of hitting their own men. The blitzkrieg that the Germans were so proud of turned into a rat war, Rattenkrieg. Tanks couldn't move through the rubble, planes couldn't bomb, and German soldiers were forced to use bayonets and entrenching tools to fight the Soviets room by room. Sometimes, the living room belonged to the Germans, and the kitchen to the Soviets. The first floor was German, the second floor Soviet. The average survival time of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was only 24 hours. Stalin watched all this coldly from Moscow. He was waiting. He was waiting for Hitler to pour all his chips, those elite panzer and infantry divisions, into the bottomless pit of Stalingrad. November 19. The time had come. When the main German force was completely sucked into the quagmire of urban street fighting, Stalin nodded. Operation Uranus began. This was not a head-on collision. It was a perfect flanking maneuver. Zhukov commanded 1 million troops to smash into the weak Romanian and Hungarian armies on Stalingrad's flanks. Like a giant pair of pliers, the jaws snapped shut in just 4 days. Hitler's elite Sixth Army, 330,000 strong, was deadlocked inside the ruins of Stalingrad. At this point, Hitler still had a chance. If he had approved a breakout, he could have saved at least 100,000 of his core troops. But he didn't. He told the pitiful General Paulus, "You must stand there like a block of iron." He promised to resupply them by air. But it was a lie. Goering's Luftwaffe couldn't do it. By January 1943, more than half of the German troops in the encirclement had frozen or starved to death. The final ending was filled with a tragic color akin to dark humor. January 30. Hitler sent a telegram to the besieged Paulus, promoting him to field marshal. What did this mean? This was not a reward, it was a death warrant. In German military history, no field marshal had ever been taken alive. Hitler's subtext was, "Paulus, I give you the marshal's baton, so you will commit suicide. Use your death to sound the final note of this tragic epic." Hitler expected a Wagnerian heroic finale, the last German field marshal, after firing his last bullet, taking his own life. But he underestimated the human will to live and overestimated his own charisma. The next day, January 31, Paulus, a field marshal for less than 24 hours, walked out of his filth-ridden, blood-reeking basement and surrendered to the Soviets. When the news reached the Wolf's Lair, Hitler went berserk. He roared to those around him, "Look at this, Paulus. How hard is it to put a pistol to your head?" He actually chose to go to Moscow and eat prison food. Meanwhile, Stalin stood before the map in the Kremlin, looking at the giant red arrow. He had won. This battle not only annihilated a German army group, but more importantly, he had broken the spine of Nazi Germany. From then on, the Germans never launched another decent strategic offensive. The Battle of Stalingrad was not only a turning point in the war, but the pinnacle of Stalin's personal prestige. The whole world saw that Stalin, once considered a tyrant, a butcher, even a fool, had defeated the invincible Hitler. Churchill sent him the Sword of Stalingrad, and Roosevelt sang his praises. From this victory, Stalin gained a new confidence. This confidence was no longer blind arrogance, but a cold dominance based on immense industrial power and a military machine. He knew Hitler was already a walking corpse. Next, all he had to do was activate the terrifying industrial monster of the Soviet Union and use a torrent of steel to push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Spring 1943. An eerie calm settled over the Eastern Front. It was like the sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Both sides were accumulating strength, preparing to deliver a fatal blow. Hitler pinned his bets on new weapons. German factories were working day and night to produce the famous Tiger and Panther tanks. These tanks featured exquisite craftsmanship, heavy armor, and precise guns. They were practically works of art. Hitler believed that quality could defeat quantity. And Stalin? Stalin was looking at a production report from the Ural Mountains. Hidden behind this report was the greatest miracle in the history of industrial warfare, and also the most brutal one, the Great Evacuation to the Urals. Back in 1941, when the Germans first invaded, Stalin made a decision of immense strategic foresight. He ordered the creation of an evacuation committee. Before the Germans could occupy the Western Soviet Union, thousands of factories, along with millions of workers and their equipment, were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved thousands of kilometers away to the Urals and Siberia. It was an epic race against time. Imagine this. On a frozen wasteland of ice and snow, trains would unload equipment, and workers wouldn't even wait to build roofs. They would begin installing machines in the open air. Snow fell on the lathes, and workers' hands froze and stuck to the metal, tearing off layers of skin. Who created this miracle? Besides the patriotic fervor of the Soviet workers, there was a dark force that cannot be ignored: Beria and his gulag. As the overseer of the home front, Beria turned labor camps into massive arsenals. Countless prisoners dug ore and built railways at gunpoint. While this slave economy was cruel, it demonstrated terrifying efficiency in wartime. It was this system that allowed the Soviet Union to produce a staggering number of weapons by 1943. This was Stalin's philosophy. Quantity has a quality all its own. In the man-hours it took the Germans to build one precision-engineered Tiger, the Soviets could build 3, maybe 4 rough T-34 seconds. The T-34 had no air conditioning, no comfortable seats, and the workmanship was as rough as a tractor. Some even had gaps in the welding. But it had a gun that could penetrate German armor and an engine that would start in the heavy snow. That was enough. July 1943. These two forces of steel met on the steppes of Kursk. This was the famous Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. Hitler amassed his final elite forces, 900,000 troops and 2,700 tanks, launching an offensive code named Operation Citadel. He wanted to replicate the miracle of the Blitzkrieg, but this time, Stalin did not attack blindly, as he had in 1941. He listened once again to the advice of Zhukov and Vasilevsky: defend. Around the Kursk salient, the Soviet army dug thousands of kilometers of trenches, laid hundreds of thousands of mines, and set up 8 defensive lines. Stalin was like a patient spider, weaving a massive web of steel, waiting for the German beetle to crash into it. July 5. The gates of hell opened. On the plains of Kursk, thousands of tanks strangled each other. Smoke and dust choked the sun. Tanks from both sides rammed into one another, and soldiers leaped out to fight hand-to-hand with grenades and bayonets. German ace tankers discovered with horror that no matter how many T-34 seconds they destroyed, more would swarm over the horizon. It was an endless nightmare. A German officer wrote desperately in his diary, "We are fighting a hydra. You cut off one head, and 2 more grow back." The result of the battle was catastrophic. Although Soviet losses were far greater than German losses, Soviet factories could replace the lost tanks in a month. German industry, however, had been dragged down by Allied bombing and resource shortages. Every tank lost was one less they would ever have. After the Battle of Kursk, Hitler completely lost the initiative. From this moment on, the death knell of Nazi Germany began to toll. By 1944, Stalin's art of war had reached perfection. He was no longer satisfied with simple bulldozer-style attacks. He and his marshals planned a series of strategic offensives, codenamed the 10 Stalinist Blows. The most spectacular of these was Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. It was a textbook example of deep operations. Through perfect camouflage and deception, the Soviets made the Germans believe the attack would come in the south. Instead, they launched an overwhelming assault through the marshes of the Central Front. 2.4 million Red Army soldiers flooded over Army Group Center like a tidal wave. During this operation, Stalin displayed his cold sense of humor. To humiliate Hitler, he organized a special parade in Moscow. 57,000 captured German soldiers marched at bayonet point, filed through the streets of Moscow. Following at the end of the column were street sweeper trucks, symbolizing the washing away of Nazi filth from Soviet soil. Stalin stood on the balcony of the Kremlin, watching these dejected Germans. 3 years prior, Hitler had boasted he would review his troops here. 3 years later, his soldiers had indeed arrived, but as prisoners of war. At this moment, Stalin's gaze had already transcended the battlefield. His tanks had entered Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. He no longer saw German defensive lines. He saw the map of post-war Europe. With every city he captured, he established a pro-Soviet regime. He was using tank treads to mark the borders of the future Red Empire. Churchill and Roosevelt began to feel uneasy. They realized they were defeating a devil, only to release a giant. Now, only one goal lay before Stalin: Berlin. This was not just a military objective, it was a political totem. Stalin was determined that the Red Army must be the first to plant its flag on the Reichstag. For this, he was willing to let his soldiers die. In the final sprint, Stalin would reveal his ultimate coldness as a politician. To reach Berlin before the Allies, he would pit his own two marshals, Zhukov and Konev, against each other in a death race. April 1945. Nazi Germany was already a zombie. Though it was still twitching, its death was sealed. Stalin's eyes no longer held the fear of 1941. It had been replaced by a greedy urgency. Standing before the map in the Kremlin, clutching that famous red and blue pencil, he stared fixedly at Berlin. Although the occupation zones had been defined at the Yalta Conference, placing Berlin within the Soviet zone, Stalin didn't trust Churchill or Roosevelt for a second. Privately, he told Molotov, "History tells us that treaties are meant to be torn up. If Eisenhower's army reaches Berlin first, do you really think they'll hand us the keys?" More importantly, Soviet intelligence discovered that the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin held Nazi Germany's nuclear research data and uranium. Stalin was secretly advancing the Soviet atomic bomb project, and he had to snatch these brains before the Americans did. And so, Stalin directed the final and bloodiest race for power of his life. He summoned the Soviet Union's two most famous marshals, Zhukov and Konev, to Moscow. In his office, Stalin pointed to Berlin on the map and asked coldly, "So, who will take Berlin? Us or the Allies?" Both marshals immediately stood up and pledged, "Comrade Stalin, us, of course." Stalin nodded, then made an incredibly insidious move. He drew a boundary line between Zhukov's first Belarusian front and Konev's first Ukrainian front. However, the line stopped abruptly 60 kilometers short of Berlin. Stalin didn't speak, but his meaning was crystal clear. Whoever crosses those final 60 kilometers first gets the glory of Berlin. This competition led to terrible consequences. To claim the top credit, Zhukov threw his troops into a frontal assault on the heavily defended Silo Heights without proper cover. There, the Soviets turned on hundreds of high-power searchlights, attempting to blind the Germans. Instead, the light reflected off the thick smoke and dust, exposing their own positions. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were mowed down by German machine guns. But Stalin didn't care about casualty numbers. He only cared about time. He constantly called Zhukov. "Konev is moving fast. What are you stalling for?" Driven by this frantic urging, on April 30, Soviet troops finally stormed into the center of Berlin. That afternoon, deep underground in the Führer bunker, the other protagonist of this dual gamble, Hitler met his doom. It was a contrast of immense symbolic power. Above ground, the deafening roar of Soviet tank treads and Katyusha rockets pulverized the last structures of the Third Reich. Below ground, the madman who once vowed to destroy Moscow lay with trembling hands, biting into a cyanide capsule while pulling the trigger of a Walther pistol. Hitler committed suicide. His body was dragged into the garden, doused with gasoline, and burned. The arrogant Nazi empire ultimately turned into a pile of charred remains. Hours later, 2 Soviet soldiers climbed the dome of the Reichstag and planted a massive red flag in the Berlin night sky. This scene was captured by a photographer, becoming one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. Stalin had won. He won thoroughly, and he won cruelly. The 24th of June, 1945, Red Square, Moscow. A grand victory parade was underway. The rain was pouring, but no one moved. Stalin stood on the reviewing stand of Lenin's mausoleum, wearing the uniform of the Generalissimo, staring expressionlessly ahead. The climax of the parade came when a column of Soviet soldiers marched across Red Square, dragging 200 captured Nazi military banners on the wet pavement. When they reached the mausoleum, the soldiers hurled these mud-stained swastika flags like trash onto the ground at Stalin's feet. This moment was the pinnacle of Stalin's life. He was no longer the Georgian peasant, no longer Lenin's shadow. He was the Red God who had defeated the fascist beast. But the story did not end with cheers. For Stalin, victory did not mean peace. It only meant the beginning of new fears. Shortly after the victory parade, that familiar, icy suspicion returned to Stalin's eyes. He looked at Marshal Zhukov, riding a white horse and stealing the spotlight at the parade, and felt not gratitude, but a threat. In his logic, Napoleon had risen to power through military merit. Zhukov's prestige was too high enough to cause sleepless nights. And so, the purges returned. Zhukov was demoted to the remote Odessa military district on trumped-up charges. A large number of generals who had distinguished themselves in the war were arrested and interrogated. Even the Allies transformed from yesterday's comrades into today's enemies. When Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Stalin sneered. In truth, that Iron Curtain had been drawn by Stalin himself the moment Soviet tanks rolled into Eastern Europe. 1,400 days. From that panicked morning in June 1941 to that carnival night in May 1945, Stalin and Hitler, the two greatest gamblers of the 20th century, used half the globe as their chessboard for a high-stakes wager. We know the ending. Hitler lost his life, and Germany lost its future. Stalin won the war, but the price he paid was 27 million Soviet lives. This figure means that for 4 whole years, on average, 13 Soviet people died every minute. This war thoroughly changed Stalin. He evolved from an insecure domestic dictator into a ruthless geopolitical master. He was no longer content with defending the Soviet Union. He wanted to control Europe, and he wanted to stand as an equal to the United States. World War II ended, but humanity did not welcome true peace. Over the ruins of Berlin, the fog of the Cold War was already rising. And Stalin, carrying the harder, more closed-off logic he had honed in the war, walked into the atomic age. In this gamble, there were no winners, only survivors. If you enjoyed this dual style of historical reconstruction, please do not hesitate to like and share. This is very important to us. Tell me in the comments, which pair of historical mortal enemies would you like to see decoded next? Is it the nuclear button game between Kennedy and Khrushchev? Or the 20-year grudge between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong?